You how I transformed this raw FDM 3D print into the final painted piece. This piece started as a simple FDM 3D print that I named Madame Toadwell. Frog-faced Dizzy, but like most prints, it came out with those visible layer lines and small imperfections that can distract from the final look. So in this part of the video, I'm showing you how I coat the entire statue with a thin layer of UV resin to smooth out the surface and prep it for painting later on in the final result. Madame Toadwell herself is a whimsical little witch toad I modeled and printed myself. She's got this fun, moody attitude and a ton of tiny details, so the smoother the finish, the better she'll look once we start painting. You'll see how the resin starts to fill those layer gaps, rounding out the forms, and making her look like a solid sculpt instead of a typical FDM print. And brushing on a thin, even layer of UV resin over the entire model. The goal is to fill in the small gaps between layers and create a nice smooth surface without losing any of the tiny sculpted details. Once the resin is applied, I carefully rotate the model to check for any drips or uneven spots before curing it under UV light. This part of the process is all about patience. Thin layers are key. Too much resin can create air bubbles, so I'll show how to get that perfect coat that hides print lines but keeps the detail crisp. You'll see close-ups of how the resin changes the look of the print and makes it feel more like a finished sculpture. It's a satisfying step that really transforms the piece before color even touches it. If you want to print your own Madame Toadwell, you can find the file on makerworld. Just search for Madame Toadwell or check the link below in the description. You'll notice right away how much of a difference the resin coat makes. The print lines start to disappear, and the whole figure takes on a solid, unified look. It's a satisfying step that really elevates any 3D print from hobby quality to display ready. After brushing on the resin, I rotate the model slowly to check the coverage and then cure it with a UV light. You'll see how the resin starts to level out, giving the surface a nice glossy finish. Once cured, the surface becomes much smoother and ready for sanding or painting, depending on how perfect you want the finish to be. Now it's time for one of my favorite parts, painting. I start airbrushing the base coat on my 3D printed statue, Madame Toadwell. Since most parts of her design are black, like her hat, dress, and parts of the toad itself, I begin with a smooth, even coat of matte black paint using the airbrush. I'm keeping the airbrush pressure low to get an even coat without clogging or overspray like last time, making sure all those small corners and textured spots are fully covered. You'll see how the black brings out the shapes and fine details that were hidden in the raw print. After this base coat dries, I'll be moving on to the next stage, hand brushing the colors to add character, highlights, and personality to the model. That's where the fun really begins, and you'll see the transformation step by step as the piece comes to life. Now that the black base coat is done and fully dried, it's time to bring this 3D print to life with color. In this part of the project, I'm switching over from the airbrush to traditional brush painting, focusing on building up the toad's green skin tone and giving it that realistic, slightly enchanted look. Take my time with the brush to build up the color gradually. The goal is to keep some of that dark black base showing through in the shadows, while blending lighter green tones on top for highlights. This really helps create depth and dimension, making the toad's skin look more organic and less flat. Keep my brush strokes light and controlled, almost like dry brushing, especially around the raised textures of the model. This technique helps accentuate the sculpted details, bumps, folds, and little warts, giving it a more lifelike, tactile look. You can already see how the toad's personality starts emerging as I work the paint into those textures. The trick here is not to rush. Each layer of paint adds to the story of the model. And when you take your time, you start to see how the different tones interact. Around the edges of the face and the top of the head, I focus on softer blending. I let some of that darker undercoat peek through in the folds, which helps give a realistic shadow effect without even needing a wash yet. As I keep painting, I notice how the textures from the 3D print really help guide where the paint should go. The tiny bumps and surface details act like natural markers for where to place highlights or darker shadows. This makes the toad's skin look rough and alive, just like a real one. As I paint, I rotate the figure under the light to check how the colors react. You can really see how the highlights shimmer slightly, while the shadows deepen the curves of the sculpt. That mix of matte and soft shine gives the illusion of real skin. This is the part where the toad starts taking on its full personality, not just a 3D print anymore, but a little magical creature. The green tones are rich, layered, and full of life, with a nice mix of cool and warm hues blending together naturally. Madame Toadwell is almost complete, and every brushstroke gets her closer to becoming a true magical showpiece. Now that the toad's skin tone is done, I move on to painting the bubbling liquid, the witch's brew. For this part, I'm using a light green paint to capture that glowing, magical effect inside the cauldron. The lighter tone instantly stands out against the darker greens of the toad and gives the whole piece a nice mystical contrast. Brushing the color into the center of the bubbles, keeping the edges slightly darker to make them look round and full. The trick here is to layer the greens, using a mix of neon or lime green in the center and fading out toward the edges. This creates that illusion of glowing liquid or enchanted energy. This part is super fun because the bright green contrasts beautifully with the toad's darker skin. The colors balance perfectly, giving the scene that classic witchy potion vibe. Now that the bubbling green brew is finished, I move on to the broomstick, using a light brown color to bring out its natural wooden texture. This part really starts to tie the whole scene together. The earthy tone of the broom contrasts nicely against the bright greens of the toad and the cauldron. I start by brushing on a thin layer of light brown, making sure to keep my strokes going in the same direction as the grain of the broom handle. That simple trick helps the paint mimic real wood fibers, giving it a more natural and handcrafted look. The light brown gives the whole piece warmth and balance, breaking up all the greens and adding a bit of rustic charm. It's a small detail, but it helps complete the story. The little witchling's trusty broom, ready for flight. After finishing the broom handle, I move on to the besom broom, the bristle part. And this time I'm using a dark brown shade to give it that authentic, natural witch broom look. The darker color instantly adds depth and realism, making the broom feel like it's made from real twigs and straw gathered by hand. I start by applying the dark brown carefully between each sculpted strand, making sure the paint settles into the grooves. This helps define the texture and separates each bristle visually. I let a bit of the lighter underlayer peek through. That mix of tones gives it that natural, weathered wood effect. Now it's time to move on to the witch's cauldron, and for this part, I'm switching things up with a bold purple paint. I wanted something that stands out against the greens of the toad and the bubbling brew, and purple adds that perfect mystical, enchanted vibe to the whole scene. Brushing on a smooth layer of deep purple over the entire cauldron, making sure the paint goes on evenly to cover all the corners and curves. The color instantly gives it a magical look, like something straight out of a witch's workshop. As the paint starts drying, I go in with a slightly darker shade of purple around the bottom and edges to create shadows and depth. The color combination of purple, green, and brown creates a perfect balance. Spooky, magical, and warm all at once. You can almost imagine the brew bubbling, glowing, and giving off that eerie light as the little toad which gets ready for a spell. Now it's time to paint the fire under the cauldron, and for this part, I'm starting with a bright red base coat. The red instantly adds energy and warmth to the scene, making the whole setup come alive. Even at this stage, the red pops beautifully against the purple cauldron and green potion. It adds that fiery contrast that really completes the witchy atmosphere. It's like you can almost feel the heat from the bubbling brew. Now that all the colors are painted and the details are finished, it's time for the final step, sealing everything with a lacquer gloss clear coat. This is one of my favorite parts because it completely transforms the piece from a painted model into a finished professional-looking statue. And here it is, the final result. After all the sanding, priming, airbrushing, brush painting, and sealing, Madame Toadwell is finally complete.